Good. Well, I hope you are refreshed. I'm aiming to finish by 9 o'clock. So, obviously, we've just been talking about Alexander the Great and how his kingdom broke down after his death into 4 different groups, different kingdoms around the world. Oh, Mary Jane just pointed out an error with my notes, by the way. In that table, it says the Assyrian Empire or kingdom. It should say the Persian Empire. The Assyrian one was before the Babylonian, not after. So feel free to cross that out and put the Persian Empire. It was still based in Assyria, but anyway, that's another story. In that table that you've got in your notes, where it talks about the Old Testament and the New Testament, the first one says the Assyrian Empire and the Greek Empire. It should say the Persian Empire. Oh, Roman Empire, yeah, when Jesus is, yeah. So it should say the Persian Empire. The Old Testament, on the Old Testament side, the New Testament is Roman, so. Sorry, that's me typing notes too quickly. Okay, I've just put this map up. I found this on Wikipedia earlier. But I like this map. It's not accurate, but it does show this area here. There was never a time when this area was the middle bit, one empire and the other. But it does show that Israel changed sides between the Seleucid Empire, which is the yellow bit, and the Ptolemy Empire, which is this bit in Egypt, which is blue on this map. So I've got that there. You'll see on that map many of the areas in the world where there is trouble right now. Just down here, out of shot, is Yemen, where they're lobbing, bombs onto ships at the minute. Over here is where they're, Iran and Pakistan today have been firing missiles at each other. And where else? Everywhere else is going wrong, isn't it? Obviously, Gaza is here. Jerusalem is there. So, all the areas of the world that are on this map are the areas of the world that were in the middle of everything at that time and at this time as well. So I'm just going to zoom in that map. So we've got Israel here, Gaza and Jerusalem, and that's the bit we're going to focus on right now, because there's this huge empire of Greece. It's been divided up into 4, but the bit that we're interested in terms of the New Testament, and particularly Jesus, is this bit here. And it's coloured in yellow in the middle and blue around the outside because it changed hands a couple of times between the Ptolemy Empire in Egypt here and the Seleucid Empire up here. In fact, it was mostly in the Ptolemy area. The Ptolemy kings ruled most of the time. For 155 years, 125 of those were the Ptolemies, and then it changed hands. The Seleucid Empire grew and took over from them. And during this period of time, in general, the people were free to worship God. They were free to follow their own religion. They were taxed pretty heavily. There was this kingdom to support, armies to pay, and all of that stuff. So the taxes were high. And in Jerusalem, the high priest was ruling alongside a council of priests and elders, and were able to rule underneath the authority of the king in Egypt, who was called the Ptolemy. And you'll see the names are there. They're not particularly important from our perspective. They're just in your notes, just so you know some historical accuracy there. And so for the first 3 kings, it was all pretty smooth. And then Ptolemy IV, whose name was Philopator, around about 200, just before 200 BC, is cruel and vicious ruler. And he hated the Jews. And so he starts to persecute them, and he forced his way into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, and defiled it. And the Jews really, really hated him. And so when he died, there was sort of huge rejoicing in Jerusalem, because that means they are sort of almost free to worship God again. And then we see Ptolemy V, called Epiphanes. That word, Epiphanes, the illustrious ones, appears a couple of times. A bit later on we'll see as well another king called Epiphanes. And he was the last of the rulers of the Ptolemaic kingdom in Jerusalem. The Ptolemaic kingdom continues in Egypt, but not, they're thrown out of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is taken over by the Seleucid kingdom in, around about 198 BC. So we're seeing, for 125 years, there's sort of stability. The Ptolemies rule in Israel, but the priests are allowed to continue with worship for the best part of that. The last, the fourth Ptolemy was not allowing that, but most of them did. And then we see the Seleucids take over, and you can look into the history of all of that battle and all of those things if you're interested, but for the sake of what we're going through, there's not too much detail on that. But what's going on is Antiochus, who's in the north, in the Seleucid kingdom, tries to overthrow the Ptolemies, and there's a battle called the Battle of Panium in the Jordan Valley, and he is able to gain complete control of Palestine at that time. And then in 192, there starts a war with Rome. So while this is all going on here, over there somewhere in Rome, the empire is starting to emerge. And pretty soon, on the edges of the empire, around here and obviously up here, the Romans start to encroach onto the Greek kingdom, and particularly around about this time, they start to impose taxes on the Seleucids, basically saying, if you don't pay us taxes, we're coming to get you. So they started to do that. Around 192 BC, the Seleucid kings start to pay taxes to Rome, and therefore they increase their own taxes on the Jewish people to make up for that, to enable them to pay taxes to Rome. And so that increase in taxes and other things starts to cause division in Jerusalem amongst the ruling class. There's 2 brothers, Onias and Jason. Interestingly enough, one of those has a Greek name, Onias, the other has a Hebrew name, Jason, and it seems like their parents didn't know which way to settle, Greek or Hebrew, so they gave one each a name. And actually the 2 brothers, one was sort of Greek, his allegiance was to the Greek, and one was to the old Hebrew way, and actually it's the opposite way around that their names are, which is a bit odd, but there we go. So Onias and Jason are 2 brothers. One is the high priest, and the other wants to be the high priest. And so these factions are forming among the Jews, and actually we see here the beginning, the very, very beginning of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We'll look at that in more detail next week. But we're starting to see those who want to take on Greek culture and live the Greek way and do Greek thinking, and they say we can still worship God, but we'll do it the Greek way, and those who want to stick to traditional Hebrew Jewish values. And so Onias is the one who wants to stick to Hebrew values. He doesn't want to pay extra taxes to the Seleucids and then therefore the Romans. Jason is like, yeah, let's do this, let's go for it, and we'll pay our taxes and we'll be good citizens of the Seleucid kingdom, and that's where this sort of starts to rise up. We see that become more and more prevalent throughout the following sort of 100 years or so, and eventually when Jesus is on the scene, you see the Pharisees, who are, really ultra Hebrew Jewish people, and the Sadducees, who are following Greek culture but still worshipping God. And we see this beginning to happen right here. So Onias is the high priest. Jason wants to be the high priest and is going to do everything he can to be the high priest. And eventually he is able to do this by paying the Seleucid king lots of money to do so. So suddenly we're going from the priest being appointed because of the family to the priest being appointed because they're giving the most money to the ruling people. And then we find this name, Antiochus Epiphanes. There's a significant event in the life of the Jewish people that's related to Antiochus Epiphanes. You may have heard the expression, the abomination of desolation. It comes in Jesus' teaching, it comes in Revelation. It first happens here, underneath Antiochus Epiphanes. We'll come to that in a moment. In 175 BC, Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes, murdered Seleucus, who was the king, and took the throne. We can read about that in Daniel, and you can look those verses up. And so for him now, he's the new king, and the role of the high priest goes to the highest bidder. So first of all, that's Jason. Jason gets his wish. His brother gets kicked out. He gets made high priest because he's paid more money. And then somebody comes along with more money than him, Menelaus. And so he is made high priest, and Jason is exiled away, disappeared. And then Antiochus Epiphanes, who's the northern king, he wants to kick out the southern king, the Ptolemies. So he goes to battle in Egypt to try and destroy the Ptolemy kingdom, try and get Egypt for his own kingdom. And while he's there, a couple of things happen. First of all, a rumor emerges that he is dead. Jason, who's been exiled, thinks, great, back to Jerusalem, high priest again. So he comes back to Jerusalem, kicks out Menelaus, and makes himself high priest again. It's a rumor that's not true. Antiochus Epiphanes is still alive. And at the same time, the Roman Empire sends an envoy in a ship to go and see Antiochus Epiphanes and basically says, enough. Back to your kingdom, back to Seleucid Assyria. You're not getting Egypt. Basically, the Romans are threatening him. In fact, it said that a line was drawn around him, and the answer was required before he stepped out of that line, that he was going to comply with Roman wishes. If he didn't, they would be at war with the Roman Empire. So he has to back down. He is obviously humiliated. He returns to Assyria via Israel, because it's the route. And on his way, he's so angry, creates this huge wave of destruction as he travels. And he gets to Jerusalem, and he takes out his anger and his frustration on the Jewish people. And so you can read Daniel 11 describes some of this. Again, it's prophetic of what's going to happen. But these are the things that he did. He tore down the walls of the city. He slaughtered a great many of the Jews. He ordered the Jewish scripture to be destroyed. He forced some of the priests to eat pork. He and his soldiers brought prostitutes into the temple. He ordered that everyone was to worship the Greek gods. You were not allowed to worship Jehovah. He established the death penalty for anyone who practices circumcision or who observed the Sabbath or any of the other Jewish religious feasts and sacrifices. So basically, he's so angry, he's trying to completely wipe out Jewish worship completely and Jewish culture. And the cruelty of Antiochus in enforcing these laws is sort of a legendary thing. You can go and read the history of Antiochus Epiphanes should you want to. So the Jews must have been completely overcome in the sense of their confidence is gone, their hope is gone, and they're looking forward with no hope whatsoever. And then this event, which is described as the abomination of desolation, occurs on December the 25th, 168 BC. Antiochus offers a pig to Zeus on the altar in the temple in the Jerusalem temple. And this event stirred up the Jewish religious people so much that it precipitated a rebellion against Antiochus. And what is known as the Hasmonean revolt occurs. We're not going to look at that this week. We'll look at that next week. The Maccabee kingdom, Judah Maccabee and others, rise up to drive out the Seleucid kingdom. Now, they started with some success. Ultimately, they came to a compromise with the Seleucids. But this sort of period of independence, the Jewish were able to rule themselves, is all precipitated by this event. They're so angry with Antiochus that they rise up as a sort of almost as one to drive out the Seleucid kingdom. Antiochus just went too far and caused this incredible uprising, which is famous today amongst Jewish people. The Maccabee revolt and all of that was what was precipitated by Antiochus doing that. So there's 155 years after Alexander died of Greek rule. First the Ptolemies, second the Seleucid, but Greek rule and culture in Jerusalem and in Israel. That's what's been going on. Next week we'll look at the Hasmonean revolt, the rising up of the Jewish people to get their land back, as it were. But I just want to go through now, for the rest of the time we've got this evening, the impact that the Greek kingdom had on the Jewish culture. In your notes it says the Hellenistic culture. Those of you that have been to Greek know that that's what they call themselves. They're Helen. I'm looking at Lynn. She's been there lots of times. And so this Hellenic thing, that's what the Greeks call themselves. But for us, it's the Greek culture that is established across sort of the then known world, all the way right through from Italy, Rome, the Roman Empire, emerges with Greek still as its language and Greek thinking and culture still as its major. It just almost refines it in a way. So I want to read to you from Acts chapter 2. These are verses you've probably read or heard read a few times. Acts chapter 2, verse 5 to 12. It says, at that time there were devout Jews from every nation living in Jerusalem. When they heard the loud noise, this is when the disciples were filled with the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. When they heard the loud noise, everyone came running, and they were bewildered to hear their own languages being spoken by the believers. They're completely amazed. How can this be, they exclaimed. These people are all from Galilee, and yet we hear them speaking in our own native languages. Here we are, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Judah, Cappadocia, Pontus, the province of Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, the area of Libya around Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, and we all hear these people speaking in our own languages about the wonderful things God has done. They stood there amazed and perplexed. What can this mean? They asked each other. Now, if you were to go through that list, let me go back. To go through that list and say, where is that place, where is that place? It's pretty much all across that Greek kingdom. And people from all over the place, Jews, were scattered throughout that Greek kingdom. And they came to the temple at Jerusalem to worship, as the Jews did, for their feast days, and they were there then. But they were scattered all over the place because that was the nature of the Greek Empire. Travel was made much easier, and the Greek language was spoken across, so people could travel and move, and so when you read that list, you see people from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, are all there in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. And this is made possible because the Greek kingdom has established itself, and people have become part of that culture. And so, in a sense, the people in the earliest church were from all of that area. The people on that day that were filled with the Holy Spirit came from all over the Greek kingdom. And so, in a sense, we need to see the culture in Jerusalem has been shaped, and the culture of the Jewish people has been shaped by the kingdom that Alexander created a couple of hundred years before. The era of the Greek Empire was of worldwide influence, and the changes that take place during this period changed the world forever and prepared the way for Jesus to come and changed our culture. Our British culture is based on Greek philosophical thinking, largely. And we think almost in the way that we were taught to think because of Greek culture. So the language now is Greek across the empire. People speak their own dialects, but everybody speaks Greek. It's the same if you travel to West Africa today. Formerly French colonies, each tribe speaks its own language, but all of them speak Greek. So if you travel to Burkina Faso or Côte d'Ivoire or Mali or Niger, or those nations, all French-speaking nations, because this French kingdom existed there now. The same is true at that time of the Greek kingdom. And so all these people can communicate with each other. When the New Testament writers write in Greek, it can be understood across all of that area. In Palestine, the language is Aramaic. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic, almost certainly spoke Greek as well. We'll come to that in a moment. But, that is, they're all understanding Greek. Both the Ptolemies and Seleucid empires spoke Greek. It became the working language for everyone. In Alexandria, which was the most significant city in the world at this time, in northern Egypt, a huge Jewish synagogue emerges. Lots of people travel from Israel to Egypt. They suggest there may have been 11,000 people in the one synagogue. Greek-speaking Jews living in Egypt, and we know at that time there was a translation of the Old Testament into Greek known as the Septuagint, and when we're doing Bible study, we often look at the Septuagint because we can understand Greek more easily than Hebrew, and yet the people of the time understood Hebrew more easily and translated to Greek. So it helps us to understand the Old Testament because it was translated to Greek at that time. The thinking of the people of the time of Jesus is changed because of the Greek philosophy, culture, thinking. We know the Greek culture of philosophy is famous. Democracy was invented by the Greek Empire. The idea of debate and working out what is right and wrong by almost having an argument and seeing which argument is the best argument, weighing up the pros and the cons, all of those things out of Greek culture. It's emerging and it's changing the people of the Jewish nation. We can see the rise as a result of that, of the different interpretations of the law for the Jewish people. They are debating at that time themselves, what should we do? How do we best keep the law of Moses? And there's different schools of thought within the Jewish people because they're debating together, how do we keep the law the best way? So we see all of these things rising up, appearing in Jewish culture at this time. Voting appears. Obviously, democracy is a Greek thing. We start to see the leaders of Jesus' time, the Sanhedrin Council, again, we'll talk about that next week, they're all voted into position. And, there are 70 or 72 in the Sanhedrin. They make decisions by voting together. Obviously, there are leaders within that, but we see they are, this idea of democracy, which doesn't appear in the Old Testament, suddenly appears in the New Testament. And obviously the thinking of people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, those Greek thinkers start to change the culture. I mentioned earlier the difference between Hebrew thinking and Greek thinking. I've just listed a few things there in your notes. Hebrew thinking is that God is central. Greek thinking is, I'm at the center of it all. And that's our culture, isn't it? And we have to challenge our own sort of selfishness to say God's at the center. I serve him and I serve others, not self-serving. That's, Greek thinking. Hebrew thinking is that God is the lawgiver. He is the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. Greek thinking is that the law is created to suit society. Whatever serves society best is what the law should be and can be changed. It can be amended. That is where we live as a culture, isn't it? We have a parliament that creates laws and we create what we think is best for society. Whereas Hebrew thinking is God decides. Hebrew thinking, I sort of mentioned, God is the arbiter of right and wrong. Greek thinking is all about ethics or divine virtue rather than values. Good things, doing good things, that's good, rather than the set values that God makes. Hebrew thinking is that God is creator of all things, whereas Greek thinking is they're searching for reasons. They're searching for how did we come, not non-mythical events. So we could go on with those lists and create more and more, but that's just to give you some idea of what's happening in Israel at this time. So the Greeks have got a major influence on Jewish theology as well. The Jews, before the Greek kingdom, had believed in a physical resurrection of the dead. They believed in a physical afterlife. We see at the time of Jesus, there's these two factions. The Pharisees who believe there's a physical resurrection. The Sadducees who do not, because they've taken on Greek thinking. The Greek thinking is the afterlife is not physical, it's spiritual. There is an afterlife, but it's a spiritual afterlife. It's an ethereal sort of out there, we don't really know. Whereas the Pharisees and the Hebrew thinking is there's a physical resurrection of the dead. And you see that manifest a whole bunch of times in the New Testament, in Jesus' teaching. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are arguing about whether there's a resurrection of the dead or not. And the same is true when Paul is put on trial. The Sadducees bring him on trial, and he comes to the trial and he says, I'm on trial here today because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees in the room immediately come to his support, and the Sadducees in the room, no, he's a terrible... You can see some people have adopted Greek thinking, some people have got the old thinking, and this is the huge clash that's going on at the time of Jesus. What do? Do we stick the old traditional teaching, or do we follow Greek teaching? And this thing was going on, and we'll find a little bit more about that next week. So we've got what we call Hellenistic Jews. So these are Jews that are trying to find a way to adopt Greek culture but still worship God. They want to take on their very best things of Greek culture. They want to do, the Olympic Games, and they want to do philosophy, and they want to do theatre, and they want all of that stuff. Oh, this is great. We love it. But we still want to worship God. So you've got these Hellenistic Jews, and they're keen to proselytize. They're keen to say to those who are not Jews, come and be a Jew. You can be a Jew, but also be a Greek. That's what's going on here. And as we've read there in Acts, the Jews have been dispersed all over the world. And they are part of this kingdom. Alexandria was this great city for around 200 years after Alexander the Great. And that is all going on, these Hellenistic Jews. There's thousands of them in Alexandria. We see the emergence of synagogues. Obviously, Jews are supposed to go 3 times a year back to Jerusalem to worship. If you're living far away, that's not anymore possible. So probably they're going back once a year, and then they're worshipping the rest of the time in their synagogue. These are places of learning. These are places of teaching. The synagogue in Alexandria is known to have a library and a load of really, learned people. It's all going on there. And the Alexandria synagogue is described as one of the wonders of the world. And it's a Greek-speaking synagogue. And I mentioned before the Septuagint is translated and becomes the most popular version of the Old Testament scriptures for the Jews of the dispersion, and would be used a great deal by the New Testament writers. Often when the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, they're quoting the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. And we see, I've got behind with my notes. There we go. We see a guy called Philo of Alexandria. He's one of the sort of prominent Jews. He heads the synagogue in Alexandria, and he goes to Rome on political missions. He's mixing at the highest levels of the Roman government. And goes to meet the emperor and all sorts of stuff. There's a whole load of stories about that stuff. He goes to see Caligula in Rome over some dispute. These Hellenistic Jews they're modernizers. They're trying to keep the age-old message of Jehovah, but put it into a modern cultural context. And so there's a divide between the Hellenists and the traditional Jews. Interestingly enough, Jesus spent his early life in Alexandria. We know it was Egypt. It was probably Alexandria. There's a huge Jewish diaspora there. So Jesus probably grew up in a Greek-speaking culture. He would have spoken Greek. He would have understood Hebrew and Egyptian and Roman culture. Jesus is incredibly, well-versed in the cultures because of his upbringing. That's an incredible thought. He knows all about this stuff. He didn't just live in Nazareth, a back city in Jerusalem all his life. He was in Egypt to start with. Mary and Joseph escaped from Herod. We'll get to Herod before we finish this stuff, but not today. So just finally, the Hellenist legacy. Really, the great change that the Hebrew Empire, the Greek Empire brought to the world was common language and common politics, common way to think. Before that time, each culture had its own sort of distinct identity. But after that time, there's almost this common way to think, this common way to do business, this common way to, put your leaders in place. All of that stuff is changing through that period of a couple of hundred years after Alexander the Great, before Jesus appears on the scene. there may, after the Hellenistic period, there may not have been religious and political agreement, but there was a common way to think about it. They didn't necessarily agree together, but they all had a common way of thinking about how all this works. So thinking and philosophy and debate and reason came to dominate rather than, almost compliance, as it were, before that to your own culture. And this is not just confined to Egypt and Palestine, but it went into Asia and also into Europe. So the common language and culture was adopted by the Roman Empire. As it grew, it was part of that Greek thinking way, and even though in Rome they spoke Latin, they kept Greek as their lingua franca as the empire grew. And so when Jesus was born, there's common language and culture which enabled the gospel to be spread. Everyone can speak the same language. When Paul is going on his journeys, he can speak. They all can understand him as long as he speaks Greek, and of course he does. Interestingly, Jesus' disciples, some of them are Greek names, some of them are Hebrew names. Simon, Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew are all Greek names. So these are probably children of Hellenized Jews. And then alongside that, we can see a bunch of other disciples, one of whom is a zealot, trying to stop the Jews, being taken over, ready to kill the Romans, all that stuff. So we've got this incredibly diverse group. We'll get to that next week, but these incredible diversity amongst the disciples themselves. So we can see how easy it was for the early church to travel, to preach, and the influence of the Hellenistic culture upon world history. So that is it for tonight. Any questions from anyone? Feel free to ask me or interrupt me while I'm talking. So next week, we're going to look at the period of independence, the Maccabee uprising, the Hasmonean kingdom, and sort of rebellion against the Seleucid kingdom, and then the rise of the Romans and how they are ruling and their political structures. But then also we're going to have a look at the various Herods and such, and then we'll look at the people groups. No, we won't get that to next week. That will be the week after. So the week after, we'll start to look at the people groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all of that bunch of people. Great. Thank you very much for listening.